Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at our Malcolm X textbook, The End of White World Supremacy, and this is the one that has the speeches by Malcolm X. Our next speech that we are looking at is the Black Revolution, and it starts on page 67. That will continue through page 80. So it's a shorter speech. Not too bad. I have also found a copy of Malcolm X giving the speech as well, and it's even shorter than what we have here in the textbook because the version I found does not include the questions and answers that Dr. Powell asks Malcolm X after the speech. So starting on page 75 of this textbook, you're going to have content that isn't available via the auditory version of the speech. So keep that in mind. There's a good, 4 pages of context that you should make sure you read separately. In terms of what I wanted to highlight today in the chapter and in the speech is the tone of the speech and some very particular content that you might disagree with or might rub you the wrong way. And it has a lot to do with the questions that are asked at the very beginning of this speech. And so on page 67, these questions include, it starts at the bottom, the second paragraph. Since the Black masses here in America are now in open revolt against the American system of segregation, will these same Black masses turn towards integration, or will they turn towards complete separation? Will these awakened Black masses demand integration into the white society that enslaved them, or will they demand complete separation from that cruel white society that has enslaved them? Will the exploited and oppressed Black masses seek integration with their white exploiters and white oppressors, or will these awakened Black masses truly revolt and separate themselves completely from this wicked race that has enslaved us? And I think these questions are key for the entire speech, almost like the thesis of the speech, because Malcolm X and what he discusses in this church space and with his audience is a notion of if groups cannot get along together, and if one group continually abuses another, why would you want to be integrated? And it's the contrary message that you might think of in terms of the civil rights movement and the civil rights period, in which you have supposedly spaces getting desegregated, and you can think of like the school situation and Little Rock, and people finally being able to go into these spaces that were denied them, but it wasn't a true integration. And Malcolm X is arguing for the opposite. And I think that it's one argument that you will not be familiar with, or maybe as comfortable with when you think about it, and in light of some of the responses that you all share in terms of we're all human, and you get this kind of colorblind rhetoric in the sense that we should see the humanity in each other and get along. And Malcolm X uses allegories from the Bible or stories to say that that doesn't make sense. And so one example is discussed on page 68 in terms of wolves and the sheep and shepherds, and whether certain animals would ever want to be integrated with predators, right? And so there's a lot of religious rhetoric going on in this speech and religious allusions again. And I think that when you approach this and you consider your response to it for the assignment this week, I would like to draw your attention to page 70 of the speech, in which Malcolm X speaks about truth and what is truth and how important it is to not be blind and to accept the truth. And so this whole page here, I think right in the center, he said that Jesus never said that Abraham Lincoln would make us free. He never said that the Congress would make us free. He never said that the Senate or Supreme Court or John Kennedy would make us free. And he continues on with, Jesus 2,000 years ago looked down the wheel of time and saw your and my plight here today. And he knew the tricky high court, Supreme Court, desegregation decisions would only lull you into a deeper sleep. And the tricky promises of the hypocritical politicians on civil rights legislation would only be designed to advance you and me from ancient slavery to modern slavery. And so this notion of lulling someone to sleep, of having just enough progress that it's enough, stop fighting for more, stop demanding equality for all or equity for all. And Malcolm X is warning you, or the audience, that you need to see the truth of the situation, and is change actually happening, and is it change that is lasting and that affects an entire community versus versus a select few in terms of who gets privileges or who gets the advancements, right? The select few. And so I think that it's really important to consider this notion of when we are seeking equity and equality for all people, what does it look like? What is this truth? Are we lying to ourselves, or do we see what's really happening around us and in our communities? And I think that on page 73 at the bottom, you hit a key point about reparations and how can an entire nation, an entire group of people that has profited off of the labors of others ever atone for this history and this outcome that has continual effects and hasn't been resolved just because of desegregation happening during the civil rights period, and in quotes, because you can argue that, of course, it has not fully happened. And it makes me think that you can think of other groups of people, like indigenous peoples, that this was, quote, their land, and it was taken from them by settlers, and how they are still fighting for their own sovereign rights to be recognized in this country and on their land and be given back the stolen, what was stolen from them. And it's a complicated and not an easy situation to figure out. And I think a key thing you might consider as you're reading this speech and or listening to it is that, can you fix something that is faulty or that is broken, a system that is broken, a way of life that is broken? And Malcolm X obviously is saying, no, you need to tear things down. You need to go back to your roots. You need to start over. And it's not an uncommon ideology that people hold. And there's a really famous quote from Audre Lorde about the master's tools never being used to dismantle the master's house. And that is mentioned, of course, not that quote, but this notion of slaves and owners, and how, even if you're looking at it from a biblical sense, when Moses helped free the slaves, they didn't want integration with their slave owners. Moses took them away and they separated to a new space that was safe and different, and that they could build from a brand new foundation. And so you might consider, what does it mean if the foundation of a way of life that we know is already broken? How do we move forward from there? And I did want to point out that there was so there is a Q&A section that starts on page 75 that is not included in the auditory speech that I'm going to share on our Canvas page. And the very first question, I think, is an important one to consider about the difference between segregation and separation. And when a community chooses to separate themselves from a dominant group, that can be empowering. That's not necessarily a negative move, and it's not the same thing as being forced into a segregation. And Malcolm X gives a really good example in terms of Chinatown and places where, for instance, with the Chinatown example, that it's Chinese-owned businesses and banks and a way of life in this community, and it's not seen as necessarily as a negative thing. And yet when a Black community tries to do something similar, it's read differently. And there was an example, and I don't have the textbook with me now, but I pulled up some notes on my other computer, and I teach this in the Intro to Race and Ethnicity class in terms of I think there's also there's a famous film. It's called The Rosewood Massacre. And there was a town in, 1922, in which it was in 1923 in Levy County, Florida. So 1923. And so I'm actually kind of interested that it's not used in this speech as an example, but the community, it's a Black community, Black owned businesses, Black homes, Black families, and it is destroyed by false allegations and by a neighboring white town. And it's why it's called a massacre. And so I might include a little bit of information about this in the module for you. And so the way in which a community chooses to create an empowering situation for themselves, and one where there was a lot of harmony and there was a lot of wealth and the community was doing well, and then a lie causes it all to be destroyed and people were killed and it was never rebuilt. And so the way communities are treated when they separate themselves, and some of these separations are very organic and they occur naturally based on the types of people that are living in certain areas. But it's just something to consider when you are reading this chapter. And so I will end there. I think that there is a lot of thought to take into consideration, and you might not be sure how you feel about some of these concepts because I think they are very non-traditional or not what we are necessarily taught when we're thinking about equality and civil rights. We don't think about separation, we think about integration. And the fact that Malcolm X is pushing or advocating for separation is might be something we're not used to. And so I really look forward to your thoughts on it. And please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.